December 10th, 1941. The skies over the Philippines were a cauldron of fire and screaming metal. For the American pilots of the 20th Pursuit Squadron, this was not combat, it was a slaughter. Lieutenant Earl Stone banked his P-40 Warhawk, hard the airframe groaning in protest, trying to shake the impossible fighter glued to his tail. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was a phantom. Impossibly light, it pivoted on a wingtip, climbing as if gravity were a mere suggestion. He watched in helpless horror as another P-40 guns, blazing in a futile act of defiance, simply disintegrated under the precise explosive fire of a 20mm cannon. There was no dogfight, no honorable duel of equals. There was only the hunter and the hunted. This was the world's brutal introduction to the Mitsubishi A6M0. For every American pilot who managed to return to Clark Field, his aircraft riddled with holes and his spirit shattered, the story was the same. The Zero was invincible. It outturned, outclimbed, and outranged anything they had. To engage it in a turning fight was suicide. To try and outrun it was a death sentence. The machine they flew, the rugged American fighter built like a brawler, felt like a lead-weighted anvil against a duelist's rapier. The myth of the Zero's supremacy was born in the smoke of burning American planes, cementing itself as an unshakable truth that bled morale from every squadron in the Pacific. But deep within that desperation, buried beneath the wreckage and fear, lay a fatal flaw. Forged in the crucible of absolute necessity, a handful of pilots would soon discover that the only way to kill a myth is not to fight it, but to rewrite the rules of war itself. The raw, visceral shock that ripped through the 20th Pursuit Squadron that day was not an isolated incident. It was a premonition, the opening salvo in a campaign of aerial dominance so complete, so absolute, that it threatened to break the back of Allied air power across the Pacific. The reports that flooded back to headquarters from the Philippines, from Wake Island, from the smouldering decks of ships off Malaya, all spoke of the same ghostly apparition. It was a fighter that defied the known laws of aerial combat, a machine that moved with an ethereal grace that was as beautiful as it was lethal. The name, once a mere intelligence designator, was now spoken in hushed, fearful tones in every ready room and on every flight line, the Zero. To understand the terror it inspired, one had to first understand that the Zero was not merely an aircraft. It was a philosophy of war forged into duralumin and steel. The architect of this phantom was Jiro Horikoshi, a brilliant but unassuming engineer who was given a seemingly impossible mandate by the Imperial Japanese Navy: build a carrier-based fighter that could outperform any land-based fighter in the world. It needed unrivaled maneuverability, a climb rate that could touch the heavens, and above all, a staggering operational range for the vast Pacific Ocean. Was a tyrant that punished short-legged aircraft. To achieve this, Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi made a pact with the devil. They would sacrifice everything: armor, self-sealing, fuel tanks, ruggedness on the altar of performance. The result was an aircraft that weighed a mere 3,500 pounds, empty thousands of pounds lighter than its American counterparts like the P-40 Warhawk or the Navy's own F-4F Wildcat, which lumbered in at over 5,800 pounds. This fanatical devotion to weight reduction was the secret to the Zero's magic. Its most terrifying attribute was its otherworldly agility. With an exceptionally low wing loading the ratio of aircraft weight to the surface area of its wings, the Zero could execute turns that seemed to defy physics. American pilots, trained in the classic art of the turning dogfight, found themselves caught in a nightmarish trap. To engage a Zero in a horizontal turn was to commit suicide. The American P-40, a tough and heavy brawler, felt like a freight truck trying to follow a ballet dancer. A pilot attempting to match the Zero's pirouette would find the enemy fighter effortlessly sliding onto his tail, its nose tracking him with surgical precision. The American plane would strain its controls, growing heavy, threatening to stall as it bled precious energy, while the Zero remained poised, a predator toying with its exhausted prey, before delivering the final fatal blow. Its climb rate was equally demoralizing. The Zero could claw for altitude at over 3,000 feet per minute, leaving its opponents wallowing below. This gave Japanese pilots ultimate control of the vertical dimension of combat. They could initiate the fight on their terms, diving from above, and if the situation turned unfavorable, they could simply point the nose skyward and rocket away, repositioning for another attack while the American fighters struggled to recede. regain altitude. The sky itself seemed to belong to them. They could dictate the time, the place, and the rules of every single engagement. But the Zero's dominance extended far beyond the tactical dogfight. Its incredible range was a strategic weapon of immense power. Fitted with a centerline drop tank, it could roam over 1600 nautical miles from its base or carrier. This was the tyranny of range. It meant that Zeros taking off from bases in Formosa could not only reach the Philippines but could loiter over the battlefield, escorting bombers and sweeping the skies clear of defenders long after American fighters had been forced to and return to base to refuel. It created a protective bubble of air superiority that moved with the Japanese fleet, allowing them to project power across vast distances with impunity. For Allied commanders, it was a strategic nightmare. There were no safe rear areas. The Zero's long shadow could fall anywhere at any time, and when it attacked, its bite was as vicious as its flight was graceful. The Zero's armament was a perfect blend of precision and power. Two 7.7mm machine guns were mounted in the cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller, allowing for accurate aiming. But the real killers were the two Type 99 20mm cannons, one mounted in each wing, while American fighters relied on the hammering impact of multiple 50-caliber machine guns, which required a pilot to hold a steady stream of fire on a target to do critical damage. The Japanese cannons fired explosive shells. A single, well-placed 20mm round could sever control cables, shatter a cockpit, or most terrifyingly detonate a fuel tank. American planes lacking the self-sealing technology that would later become standard would simply disintegrate in a flash of orange flame. The difference was psychological. The 50 calibers chewed you apart. The 20mm cannons made you vanish. This combination of unparalleled performance and deadly firepower rapidly cemented an aura of invincibility. The Zero shock that rippled through the Allied forces was a psychological weapon as potent as the aircraft itself. Fighter pilots, by nature aggressive, confident hunters, were suddenly given a new, humiliating set of rules for survival. The first and most important rule, passed down from the few shaken veterans to the green new arrivals, was a sacrilegious commandment in the fighter pilot's Bible. Never turn with a Zero. They were taught to use their own aircraft's few advantages, superior diving speed and ruggedness, to disengage, to run. They were being taught not how to win, but how not to die. The ready rooms, once filled with bravado, became tense spaces of grim analysis and quiet fear. The Zero wasn't just a plane they had to fight. It was a monster that haunted their waking moments and stalked their dreams. This fear paralyzed tactical thinking, breeding a defensive mindset that ceded the initiative entirely to the Japanese, who flew with the supreme confidence of warriors who knew they wielded a superior blade. For them, men who were often veterans of the war in China and imbued with the Bushido code, the Zero was an extension of their own martial spirit, a perfect weapon for a perfect warrior. This synergy of man and machine created a fighting force that in the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1942 seemed utterly, crushingly unbeatable. The reign of any tyrant, whether of land or of sky, is built upon a foundation of perceived invincibility. For months, the Zero's tyranny was absolute, sustained by a chilling drumbeat of Allied losses and the harrowing testimony of the few who survived its ghostly embrace. The myth fed on fear, and fear bred paralysis. Yet, even in the darkest hours of the Pacific War, amidst the stench of cordite and despair that clung to the ready rooms from Pearl Harbor to Port Moresby, the human mind refused to surrender. The shift from pure survival to methodical analysis was not a single event, but a gradual awakening, a dawning realization that no weapon forged by mortal hands could be perfect. The process began not in a laboratory, but in the exhausted minds of the men who had looked the phantom in the eye and lived to tell the tale. Intelligence officers, men like Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" Thatch of Fighting Squadron 3, began to sift through the after-action reports, treating them not as horror stories, but as a collection of scattered data points. They listened intently to the debriefs, filtering the adrenaline-fueled accounts for patterns, for anomalies, for any deviation from the script of the Zero's perfection. A young pilot, his hands still shaking, might recount, "I tried to turn with him and it was over. But just before he got me, I rolled and dove for the deck. He followed for a second, but he couldn't stay with me. He just gave up. Another pilot, whose wingman had been turned into a roiling ball of fire, would add, I got a lucky snapshot at him as he flew past. Just a quick burst from my 50s didn't seem like much, but his wing just shredded. The whole thing came apart. Individually, these were tales of lucky escapes. Collectively, they were the first whispers of a revolutionary truth. The Zero was a master of the horizontal turning fight, but it seemed clumsy, almost hesitant in the vertical plane, especially at high speeds. It was lethal, but it also seemed fragile. These whispers were not enough to build a strategy on, but they planted a seed of doubt. The monster, it seemed, might have a weakness. What they needed was not more conjecture. They needed to put the beast on a dissecting table. They needed a body. And in June of 1942, the fortunes of war in a single bizarre incident delivered one. Far to the north, in the desolate fog-shrouded Aleutian Islands, a Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga, his Zero, crippled by ground fire during a raid on Dutch harbour, attempted an emergency landing on the remote island of Akutan. Believing the boggy tundra below was solid ground, he lowered his landing gear. Upon touchdown, the wheels dug into the soft earth and the pristine fighter flipped onto its back, killing Koga instantly, but leaving the airframe almost completely intact. For 5 weeks, the Zero lay there, a silent testament to a minor skirmish in a forgotten theatre of the war, unseen by the world. It was discovered by a US Navy patrol plane on a routine flight, a discovery so momentous it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific. The recovery of the Akutan Zero was an intelligence coup of staggering proportions. A top-secret mission was launched to retrieve the aircraft. It was painstakingly extricated from the mud barged to the mainland and transported under heavy guard to the Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Here the myth would be subjected to the cold, unforgiving scrutiny of American engineering. Test pilots and engineers swarmed over the captured prize, their hands tracing the elegant lines that had brought so much terror to the skies. They were peeling back the skin of the Phantom, and what they found underneath was not magic, but a series of deliberate and ultimately fatal engineering compromises. The first revelation was the Zero's shocking lack of protection. Horikoshi's fanatical pursuit of lightness meant there was no armor plate to shield the pilot from bullets coming from the rear. The pilot sat in his cockpit protected by nothing more than thin duralumin skin and a silk scarf. While American pilots flew in what were essentially armored bathtubs, their Japanese counterparts were startlingly exposed. This explained why even short lucky bursts of .50 caliber fire could be so devastating. A few rounds could easily kill or incapacitate the pilot, turning the world's greatest dogfighter into a lifeless plunging coffin. Even more damning was the discovery that the Zero's fuel tanks were completely unprotected. They were not lined with the self-sealing rubber bladders that had become standard in American fighters. This technology, which used layers of rubber to automatically seal small punctures and prevent catastrophic leaks, was a lifesaver. The Zero had none of it. Its wing tanks were in essence just integral parts of the wing structure, filled with high-octane fuel. This meant that a single incendiary or tracer round piercing the wing could transform the graceful fighter into an instantaneous inferno. It was a flying tinderbox. The flaming Zeros reported by so many pilots were not exaggerations. They were the direct result of this critical design flaw. The Zero was built to dish out punishment, but it could not take it. It had a glass jaw. But the most tactically significant discovery came when American test pilots, men like Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, took the rebuilt Zero into the sky. They confirmed what the debriefs had hinted at. In a slow-speed turning fight, it was untouchable. But as they pushed the throttle forward and nosed it into a dive, the Zero's greatest strength became its most profound weakness. The light, nimble airframe that gave it such grace began to shudder under the immense G-forces. The controls, which were so light and responsive at low speeds, grew heavy and stiff. Most critically, its rate of roll at high speed was abysmal. While an F-4F Wildcat could snap into a vicious roll to evade an attacker or position itself for a shot, the Zero became sluggish, almost unresponsive. It could not roll with an American fighter in a high-speed dive. The pact with the devil had been exposed. Jiro Horikoshi had traded ruggedness for performance, durability for agility, and survivability for range. He had created the perfect duelist's rapier, but it was a rapier made of glass. It was designed for a war of elegant, one-on-one skirmishes fought by untouchable samurai of the air. It was not built for a brutal, grinding war of attrition against an enemy that flew flying bricks, an enemy that could absorb punishment, and that was now finally beginning to learn that you don't dance with a phantom. You shatter it with a sledgehammer. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was dead, killed not in a blaze of glory but in a quiet hangar in San Diego under the cold light of engineering analysis. The fear was replaced by a cold, hard calculus of tactical opportunity. The question was no longer if the Zero could be beaten, but precisely how to systematically exploit its weaknesses to tear it from the sky. The dissection of the Akuten Zero was a revelation, a moment of electrifying clarity that confirmed what scraps of intelligence and desperate pilot accounts had only hinted at. The Phantom had been unmasked, its vulnerabilities laid bare on the engineering schematics and test flight reports circulating through the highest echelons of the Navy. But knowledge, however profound, is useless without application. It was one thing for an engineer in San Diego to know that the Zero had a poor roll rate at high speed. It was another thing entirely for a young pilot, his heart pounding in his throat and a Japanese ace on his tail, to translate that knowledge into a life-saving, enemy-destroying action. The intellectual victory had to be forged into a tactical weapon, a new doctrine that could be taught, practiced, and executed under the unimaginable stress of aerial combat. This was not a task for engineers, but for a warrior. And the man who would rise to meet this challenge was a quiet, cerebral leader who had been wrestling with the Zero problem since the first disastrous encounters. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch. Thatch was the commander of Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, aboard the USS Lexington. He had seen the Zero's devastating effectiveness firsthand, and more painfully he had seen the bewildered fear in the eyes of his pilots, men he had trained and mentored. He was not a daredevil but a thinker, a chess master of the skies, who saw air combat as a complex problem of geometry and energy. The prevailing wisdom to simply dive away and use the F-4F Wildcat's superior ruggedness to escape was anathema to him. It was a doctrine of survival, not of victory. It ceded the sky to the enemy. Thatch was obsessed with finding a way not just to survive the Zero but to kill it. Night after night, in the dim light of his ready room, he would sit at a small table pushing matchsticks around to represent aircraft formations. He spent countless hours reflying lost battles in his mind, trying to understand the geometry of defeat. The core of the problem was the one-on-one engagement. In any traditional dogfight, the Wildcat's inferior agility meant it was doomed. The moment a Zero latched onto a Wildcat's tail, the American pilot was on a one-way trip to oblivion. The solution, Thatch reasoned, could not be found in individual heroics or in the performance of a single aircraft. The solution had to lie in mutual support, in turning two weaker aircraft into a single lethal entity. The answer was not a better plane, but a better idea. His epiphany came not in a flash of inspiration, but through a painstaking process of elimination. He kept returning to a single stark reality. A single Wildcat being pursued by a single Zero was a dead man. But what if there were two Wildcats? He began sketching diagrams on a notepad, envisioning a pair of American fighters flying side by side. He imagined a Zero with its typical aggressive confidence singling out one of the Wildcats, the bait, and sliding onto its tail to begin its deadly turning dance. This was the critical moment, the trigger for the entire maneuver. Under Thatch's radical new theory, the baited pilot would not try to outturn the Zero. He would not try to escape. Instead, he would broadcast a simple message over the radio: "I'm in trouble." This was the signal for his wingman, the hook, to initiate the trap. As the bait pilot continued his turn towards his wingman, the Zero pilot, his vision fixated on his prey, would be forced to follow, tightening his own turn to maintain his firing position. At that exact moment, the hook pilot would execute a hard turn in the opposite direction, also turning towards his embattled comrade. The geometry was brilliant in its simplicity. The two American fighters would crisscross their flight paths like skaters. For the Zero pilot, the situation would change with terrifying speed. One moment he had a helpless American fighter locked in his sights. The next moment, as he followed his target across the sky, he would find himself flying directly into the path of the second Wildcat, which was now in a perfect head-on firing position. The hunter had become the hunted. The Zero, for all its agility, could not escape this geometric pincer. If he broke off his attack on the bait pilot could reverse and engage him. If he continued his attack, he would be shredded by the cannons of the hook. He was trapped. This maneuver, which would become immortalized as the WWII, was a revolution in tactical thinking. It was a direct, calculated assault on the Zero's weaknesses and a masterful exploitation of the Wildcat's strengths. It negated the Zero's superior turning ability by refusing to play its game. Instead, it forced the Zero into a predictable flight path, leading it into a prearranged kill zone. It leveraged the Wildcat's superior radio communications and the American emphasis on teamwork, turning two individual fighters into a coordinated defensive and offensive unit. Most importantly, it weaponized the Wildcat's ruggedness. The bait aircraft had to be tough enough to survive the initial seconds of the Zero's attack, giving the hook time to spring the trap. The lightly built Zero, on the other hand, could not withstand the concentrated head-on barrage from the Wildcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns. Thach didn't just theorize, he tested. He took his executive officer, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, up into the skies over the Pacific and practiced the weave relentlessly. They flew it until it was second nature, a fluid, instinctive dance of mutual protection. When he was satisfied, he taught it to every pilot in his squadron. It was a hard sell at first. The idea of deliberately turning towards a pursuing enemy ran counter to every survival instinct a pilot possessed. It required an almost blind faith in your wingman, but Thach's quiet confidence and the undeniable logic of his diagrams won them over. They were no longer just a collection of pilots. They were a team armed with a secret weapon forged not of steel, but of intellect. The Thach weave was more than just a maneuver. It was the embodiment of a new philosophy. It was the American answer to the Japanese focus on individual skill and superior technology. It was the assertion that teamwork could defeat talent, that strategy could overcome performance, and that a well-executed plan by two could triumph over the brilliance of one. Jimmy Thach had not designed a new piece of hardware. He had designed a new way to think. He had looked at the invincible phantom that haunted the skies, analyzed its every strength and weakness, and conceived of a way to turn its own aggression and overconfidence into the very instrument of its destruction. He had loaded a gun, and now all he needed was a target. A theory, no matter how brilliant, is merely a ghost until it is baptized in the fire of combat. For Jimmy Thach, the matchsticks and diagrams, the long nights of intellectual wrestling and the practice runs in the empty skies over the Pacific were all a prelude to a single terrifying question. Would it work when the sky was full of enemies trying to kill him? The answer would come in the furnace of the Battle of Midway, a colossal gamble in which the fate of the entire Pacific War hung in the balance. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, as he led a flight of 6 F-4F Wildcats off the deck of the USS Yorktown to intercept the incoming Japanese strike force. He was not just a squadron commander, he was a scientist about to conduct the most dangerous experiment of his life. The sky was a canvas of chaos. Below, the American fleet maneuvered desperately. Above, the sun glinted off the canopies of what seemed like an infinite number of Japanese aircraft, Valskates and the Silver Sharks that escorted them, the A6M-0s. Thach's flight was hopelessly outnumbered. As they climbed to engage the bombers, a swarm of Zeros from the Japanese carrier Hiryu, flown by some of the most experienced and battle-hardened pilots in the Imperial Navy, detached from the main formation and dove on them with predatory grace. This was the moment of truth. The textbook dogfight was an invitation to annihilation. Survival and victory depended entirely on the unproven theory born of matchsticks and desperation. A Zero, flown with arrogant precision, latched onto the tail of Thach's wingman machinist Tom Cheek. The classic, unwinnable scenario had begun. Instinct screamed to run, to dive, to do anything to escape the inevitable stream of 20mm cannon fire. But discipline drilled into them by Thach for weeks took over. Thach got on the radio, his voice a mask of cold calm over a torrent of adrenaline. "Cheek, I'm coming around. Follow the plan." He banked his own Wildcat hard not away from the fight, but turning towards his embattled wingman. Simultaneously, he saw Cheek begin his own turn towards him. For the Japanese pilot, it must have been a bewildering sight. The American prey was not behaving as expected. It was not panicking. Instead, the two clumsy Wildcats were flying towards each other, seemingly oblivious to his superior position. Confident in his machine's agility, he tightened his turn, keeping his gun sight firmly planted on Cheek's tail, anticipating the kill. It was the last mistake he would ever make. As the two American planes began to cross paths, the geometry of Thach's trap snapped shut with the force of a bear trap. The Zero, fixated on its target, flew directly into the firing solution of Thach's Wildcat. The hunter was now the helpless target. Thach saw the rising sun insignia swell in his gun sight, the enemy pilot, a fleeting silhouette against the blue Pacific. There was no time for thought, only for action. He squeezed the trigger. The Wildcat shuddered as its 6.50 caliber machine guns opened up in a single deafening roar, a torrent of lead and tracers converging on the delicate Japanese fighter. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The tracers stitched a fiery line across the Zero's fuselage and its unprotected wing-root fuel tank. The Japanese fighter, caught completely by surprise, seemed to hesitate for a fatal second before it blossomed into a greasy black smear against the sky, cartwheeling in pieces towards the sea below. The impossible had happened, but there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero had latched onto Thach's tail. Now it was his turn to be the bait. He yelled into his radio, "I've got one, your turn," and watched as Cheek, now clear, banked hard to repeat the maneuver. Again, the crisscross pattern worked its deadly magic. The second Zero pilot, perhaps equally confused by the bizarre American tactics, was met by a head-on fusillade from Cheek's guns and suffered the same fate as his comrade. In the space of a few terrifying minutes, Thach's small flight using the weave claimed 3 Zeros with a fourth probable without losing a single American pilot to the Japanese fighters. It was a staggering, almost unbelievable outcome. In the midst of the larger, chaotic battle for Midway, this small squadron had done more than just survive. They had dominated. They had taken the most feared fighter in the world and had systematically torn it apart, not with superior technology, but with a superior idea. When Thach and his men landed back on the battered Yorktown, their aircraft riddled with holes, but their spirits soaring, the news spread like wildfire. The impact was immediate and profound. The Thach weave was no longer a theory. It was a proven battle-winning doctrine. The myth of the Zero's invincibility, which had cast such a long, dark shadow over the morale of Allied pilots, was shattered. The Phantom could bleed, and Jimmy Thach had just handed every American pilot the knife. Fear was replaced by a cold, calculating confidence. The rulebook for air combat in the Pacific had been fundamentally rewritten. Pilots now had a concrete, executable plan to counter the Zero's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. The victory at Midway was a turning point in the war, won by the heroism of dive bomber pilots and the cracking of Japanese codes. But the tactical victory achieved by Thach in the skies above the fleet was a turning point of its own. It saved countless American lives in the brutal carrier battles that would follow from the Eastern Solomons to Santa Cruz. It became the standard defensive fighter tactic for the U.S. Navy. For the rest of the war, a testament to the power of intellectual courage and the revolutionary idea that the strength of the pack could overcome the ferocity of the lone wolf. The ghost had been exorcised from the machine, and American pilots for the first time knew they had the tools not just to fight, but to win. That single desperate engagement in the skies over Midway was more than just a successful combat trial. It was the cracking of a dam. The tactical genius of the Thach weave, proven in the most unforgiving laboratory on Earth, unleashed a flood of renewed confidence and strategic possibility that would wash over the entire Pacific theater. Jimmy Thach's intellectual victory was about to be married to America's industrial might, creating a perfect storm of tactical innovation and overwhelming material superiority that would systematically dismantle the Japanese Empire's air power and seal its ultimate fate. The era of the Zero's dominance was over not because the Zero had changed, but because the Americans had. The first step in this transformation was the rapid, almost fanatical dissemination of the new doctrine. The Thach weave was no longer a squadron secret. It became the gospel. Veteran pilots from Midway men who had seen the WWII work with their own eyes were rotated back to training commands in Hawaii and the mainland United States. They became the high priests of a new kind of air combat, drilling the revolutionary tactics into the minds of thousands of green young pilots fresh out of flight school. In briefing rooms across the country, the chalkboard diagrams that once existed only in Thach's mind were now standard lesson material. Young aviators who had grown up hearing the fearful legends of the invincible Zero were now being handed a concrete step-by-step plan for its destruction. The psychological shift was immense. The old defensive mindset, run, dive, survive, was purged. In its place was an aggressive yet disciplined doctrine. Pilots were taught to think in pairs, to see their wingman not just as a companion but as an integral part of their own weapon system. They learned that the key to victory was not individual prowess in a turning fight, but situational awareness, teamwork, and a cold-blooded understanding of energy and geometry. The WWII, along with other boom and zoom tactics that exploited the Wildcat's diving speed and ruggedness, became the foundation of a new American way of aerial warfare. It was a system built not to match the enemy's strengths, but to ruthlessly exploit their weaknesses. But even as this tactical revolution was taking place, an industrial revolution was roaring to life back home. While Jimmy Thach had been devising a way for the F-4F Wildcat to beat the Zero engineers at Grumman Aircraft, working in close consultation with the Navy, were already designing its successor. They had collected every scrap of data on the Zero, its strengths, its fatal flaws, and channeled it into creating the ultimate Zero killer. The result was the F-6F Hellcat. It was not a nimble duelist, it was a beast. It was everything the Zero was not: brutally powerful, heavily armored, and built like a flying tank. When the Hellcat began arriving in the fleet in late 1943, it represented the perfect marriage of tactical doctrine and technological superiority. It was a sledgehammer designed by men who knew exactly where the glass jaw was. The Hellcat could not outturn a Zero at low speeds, and its pilots were now rigorously trained never to try, but it completely dominated it in every other aspect of flight. It had a monstrous 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine that gave it a blistering climb rate and a diving speed the fragile Zero could never hope to match. It was heavily armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, carried an abundance of ammunition, and most importantly, it featured extensive armor plating around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots now flew into battle with the tactical knowledge to outwit their enemy, and a machine that could both absorb incredible punishment and dish it out with overwhelming force. The combination of the new pilots trained in the new tactics flying the new machine was utterly devastating. The Japanese, meanwhile, were facing the grim realities of a protracted war. Their once invincible corps of elite veteran pilots, the heroes of Pearl Harbor and the early conquests, had been decimated in the grinding battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons. They were being replaced by hastily trained recruits with a fraction of the experience. Their industrial base, stretched to the breaking point, could not replace their losses or innovate at the same pace as the Americans. They were stuck with improved but fundamentally unchanged versions of the Zero, a design whose fatal flaws were now common knowledge. They were sending inexperienced pilots in fragile planes to fight against experienced pilots in flying tanks who knew their every weakness. The result was not a battle. It was a massacre. This grim new reality reached its apocalyptic climax on the 19th of June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In a desperate attempt to halt the American advance, the Japanese launched a massive aerial assault on the U.S. Fifth Fleet. It was the largest carrier battle of the war, but the swarms of Japanese aircraft were met by hundreds of F-6F Hellcats, flown by pilots who were masters of the new American doctrine. What followed was an aerial slaughter of such epic proportions that the American pilots themselves nicknamed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Flying in disciplined, mutually supporting formations, the Hellcat pilots tore into the Japanese formations. They refused to be drawn into turning fights, instead using their superior speed and altitude to make slashing high-speed passes, riddling the fragile Japanese planes with 50 caliber fire before rocketing away to set up another attack. The results were staggering. In a single day, the US Navy pilots shot down over 400 Japanese aircraft, while losing only a handful of their own. The kill-to-loss ratio was almost unbelievable, a brutal testament to the complete and total dominance they had achieved. The Japanese naval air arm was effectively annihilated in a single afternoon, a blow from which it would never recover. The legacy of this transformation is a powerful lesson in the nature of warfare. The story of the Zero versus the Wildcat and Hellcat is the ultimate refutation of the idea of a wonder weapon. It demonstrates that technological superiority is fleeting, and that no single advantage can compensate for a lack of adaptability. The Japanese possessed a superior fighter at the start of the war, but they became victims of their own success, clinging to a winning formula long after their enemy had learned how to dissect and defeat it. The Americans, dealt a losing hand, were forced to innovate or die. They responded not by copying their enemy, but by creating a comprehensive system, a combination of intelligence, tactical innovation, superior training, and overwhelming industrial production that rendered the enemy's initial advantage irrelevant. The Thash weave and the philosophy behind it became a cornerstone of American air combat doctrine for generations. It cemented the importance of teamwork, mutual support, and the critical need to understand and exploit an enemy's vulnerabilities rather than engaging their strengths. It was a victory of mind over matter, of system over individual, a story that began with the desperate scrawlings of one man on a notepad and ended with the skies over the Pacific being swept clean of an enemy that had once seemed invincible. The story of the Mitsubishi A6M0 did not end in a single climactic duel against a worthy adversary. Its reign of terror, which began with a ghostly silhouette sweeping unsuspecting P-42s from the skies over the Philippines, concluded in 1,000 anonymous fiery deaths over the vast expanse of the Pacific. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, administered by a foe that had learned, adapted, and ultimately systematized its destruction. The journey from the initial paralyzing shock of the Zero's perfection to the cold industrial efficiency of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot stands as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the history of warfare. It was a testament to the fact that in the crucible of conflict, the side that learns the fastest wins. Ultimately, the fall of the Zero was not merely the story of a superior weapon being replaced by a better one. It was a clash of doctrines, a war of philosophies. The Japanese entered the conflict with a near-perfect instrument of aerial combat, a duelist's rapier wielded by warrior artists. Their strategy was built upon the foundation of this initial technological supremacy and the individual brilliance of their elite pilots. But this perfection became a prison. Trapped by the dogma of their own success, they failed to anticipate an enemy that did not seek to build a better rapier but instead chose to counter it with a sledgehammer guided by a revolutionary new set of rules. The American response was not elegant. It was pragmatic, brutal, and systematic. It was a victory of the collective over the individual, of the system over the single platform. The quiet genius of men like Jimmy Thash provided the intellectual spark, a revolution in thought that transformed the very geometry of air combat. His weave was more than a tactic. It was a philosophical statement that the bonds between pilots, the trust in a shared plan, could be a weapon more potent than any cannon. This intellectual spark was then fanned into an inferno by the awesome power of American industry. The F-6F Hellcat was the physical embodiment of the lessons learned in Blood and Fire, a machine explicitly designed not to dance with the Zero but to break it. When this superior machine was put into the hands of thousands of pilots, all rigorously trained in the new doctrine of teamwork and energy fighting, the outcome was inevitable. The Japanese ace flying his fragile, exquisite fighter was no longer facing a single American opponent. He was facing an entire interconnected system of destruction. In the final analysis, the Zero stands as a timeless and cautionary tale. It is a monument to the hubris of believing in a perfect, unbeatable weapon, a warning that technological advantage is a fleeting shadow. The American victory that rose from the ashes of Pearl Harbor was not preordained by destiny or guaranteed by industrial might alone. It was earned in the desperate late-night sessions with matchsticks on a table, proven in the terrifying crucible of Midway, and scaled to a war-winning magnitude by a nation that was willing to learn from its failures and innovate. Under unimaginable pressure, it proved that in the crucible of war the most powerful weapon is not forged from steel, but from the mind.